Hello, this is Dr. Alexander Rosenthal, the founder and director of the Petrarch Institute. I'm here with my colleague and co-founder, Dr. Miles Smith. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to everyone we've seen before our previous podcasts. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. You're joining two of the principal characters at the Petrarch Institute. We provide online education in the classics and the humanities from the Renaissance era as well. By way of reintroducing the fellow you saw first, Alex is not only the director, he's the lead lecturer in courses such as our course on the virtues. Alex, do you want to tell them a little bit about that?
Sure. So in October, we're going to have a course on one of the most central concepts for the Greeks, which is the concept of virtue. And it's actually going to focus on one of the figures that we're going to discuss today, Aristotle, as well as Plato. And, it's basically designed for people who may not have a very intense knowledge of philosophy, may not have been a philosophy major, but nonetheless have an interest in a question I think we're all interested in, the question of the good life. How does one go about living a good life? And these are some of the greatest thinkers of antiquity dealing with this very question. So if people are interested, please email me at alex@petrarch-institute.com, and our course will be starting in October, and I think you'll find the pricing as well much to your liking.
That's terrific. Now, Alex, one of the people without whom that course would be almost impossible or almost unthinkable, certainly, is Aristotle. And some of the more keen-eyed viewers may see him as the figure in blue hovering like a little angel over your right shoulder in Raphael's painting of the Academy. But other than that little diminutive presence hanging over you, who was Aristotle?
Right. Who was Aristotle indeed? Well, if you listen to St. Thomas Aquinas, and Aristotle was the philosopher, the representative of philosophy. If you listen to Dante, he was the master of those who know, which I think gives you a little sense of the reign which Aristotle enjoyed over the European mind for centuries, but not only in the past. Charles Murray, who wrote what I think was, whether you agree or disagree with his conclusions and picks and methods, I think was quite a fascinating book on human accomplishment. And when he wrote that book, he did an interview with UPI, and they asked him who he thought was the most accomplished person who ever lived, and this is what he responded. He said, "Now we're talking personal opinion because the methods I use don't work across domains, but I have an emphatic opinion, Aristotle. He more or less invented logic, which was of pivotal importance in human history, and no other civilization ever came up with it independently. He wrote the essay on ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics, that to my mind contains the bedrock truths about the nature of living a satisfying human life. He made huge contributions to aesthetics, political theory, methods of classification, and scientific observation. Who else even comes close?" That was Charles Murray's take. One last thing, it's sort of, Aristotle sort of is the last philosopher, what's called the classical age of Greece, that sort of ends with the death of Alexander the Great. And I think in philosophy we can say that I think you got a sense of sort of the encyclopedic scope of Aristotle's mind. So if they say Socrates was, Greek philosophy sort of begins with a study of nature, and they say Socrates brought philosophy down from the heavens and into the world of men, into the world of ethics. Aristotle is really the figure that brings it all together, right? Brings the study of nature, and he made contributions to the early scientific explorations of zoology and biology and geology and astronomy, as well as literary theory, and he's really, as Charles Murray said, the inventor of logic, as well as ethics and politics in that much more human sphere. So he's really sort of the great synthetic thinker of ancient Greek philosophy.
You just painted a portrait, Alex, of someone who's one of the very earliest systematic thinkers, and also someone who is a classical thinker in the fullest sense, by which in part we mean a classifying thinker, someone who had knowledge as a doctor, a physician, a student of nature, a student of culture, a student of man, his desire to know his motives, among people who paid tribute to not just the comprehensiveness but the scientific value of what he did are people like Darwin, who viewed him centuries, really millennia later, as a kind of father in science. So did you want to give people a sense of his contributions to logic, which I guess we still use today, and to natural philosophy?
Sure. So, I mean, it might be a good idea, though, to just give a little bit on just a quick run-through of sort of his biography, which partially explains his interest in science. So he's born about 384 BC in the city of Stagira, which is in sort of the Macedonian sphere, and his father was a doctor in the Macedonian court. And I think it's probably not too. I mean, it's probably a good speculation to think that his father's vocation as a doctor could help explain his keen interest in the sciences, right? Which is stronger in Aristotle than in Plato. Now, when he's about 17 years old, he goes to Athens and becomes essentially the star pupil of Plato, right? He stays in the academy from about the age of 17 for another 20 years or so until the death of Plato. When Plato dies, the successor to the academy is his nephew Speusippus. We don't know exactly what happened, but they probably didn't get on that well. Or Aristotle may have already been developing independent theories, and he leaves to go to Asia Minor, where he spends time with another student at the academy, Hermias, who is the ruler of a city there. And he stays there for several years and actually marries his daughter, Hermias' daughter. Now, after those years there, he leaves. Now, by the way, what happens to Hermias is an ally of Philip of Macedon, right, who is planning an invasion of Persia. And so he gets captured by the Persians and tortured. And one of the last things he said was, "I have done nothing unworthy of philosophy," which sort of testifies to Aristotle's probable influence on him. And he goes then to Macedon, right, under Philip, where he becomes the tutor to his young son Alexander, right? And he's provided with a library and research facilities and these sorts of things. And he was the tutor to the young son Alexander. Alexander would later say that my father gave me life, but Aristotle taught me how to live well, right? How to use it, right? And when Alexander, after the assassination of Philip, when Alexander's getting ready for his campaigns against Persia, he goes to Athens, where he founds his own school, the Lyceum. The students at the Lyceum are known as the Peripatetics because of their habit of walking around and talking, as many sort of philosophers are apt to do. And he was probably also receiving a certain amount of funding for his research, and this was really his most productive time in terms of the treatises that we have. Alexander the Great, when Alexander the Great dies in 323 BC, remember the Athenians, who have been, I mean, basically the Greeks were unified by force under the Macedonians, so they were not too happy. They were not very pro-Macedonian, and Aristotle had, of course, this association from childhood with Macedon. So things were turning grim for Aristotle, and he famously said, "I will not give Athens a second opportunity to sin against philosophy." the first being, of course, the death of Socrates, and he leaves for Chalcis, where he only lived another year or so, and then he dies. So that's his biography in short. Maybe go over a little bit about his works, maybe?
That makes sense. I think it gives people a sense of really the scope of accomplishment that Charles Murray was talking about.
Yeah, so Aristotle's works, well, first of all, there's a kind of the story in antiquity about how the works were discovered was that basically his star pupil, his own star pupil, Theophrastus, had them copied and in a vault, and they were discovered much later in the 2nd century BC or so, and then they were brought to Rome under the Roman general Sulla, and people were saying, oh, look at how magnificent. Now these works are what are called the esoteric works. The esoteric works are the works which were meant for use within his Lyceum, right? So these are the works that regard that make up the text that we have today. It's thought by some people that Aristotle published as many as 170 works, of which we have only 30. And we have none of the exoteric works, right? The published works that are probably include many of the works he had written earlier in his career when he was under Plato. Many of them were dialogues, just like the Platonic dialogues. And Cicero talks about Aristotle as being this great stylist. But what we have are actually the works from his academy, these esoteric works, and yet these are the works that have largely shaped the Western mind in so many ways, right? So they include the logical works, like the prior analytics and the posterior analytics and the topics and these sorts of things. Remember, Aristotle is sort of the founder of formal logic, the science of validity and deduction and these sorts of things. And then there are his works on natural philosophy, such as the physics, on generation and corruption. He wrote many treatises on the animals and so forth, a wide variety of treatises on natural philosophy. Then is, of course, the metaphysics, which is the science of being itself, right? As well as the science of God. Right, and then these are sort of the speculative works, which he said are the sciences which aim at simply truth, right, the understanding of truth. But then there are also the works which he wrote, which have some sort of view to action, and that includes his ethical treatises, most famously the Nicomachean Ethics, as well as the Eudemian Ethics, which is a bit less well known. The Politics, his famous work on rhetoric, which is still a standard text. And I should say that his logic, up until the 19th century, I mean, Kant says that basically Aristotle set the standard as far as logic. Even Kant, who was quite critical of Aristotelianism in many ways, right, still sees Aristotelian logic as very powerful. Right, so, and then the Poetics, which is still a core text in literary theory. So I think that, I think that sort of sketches sort of the encyclopedic nature of his contributions to some degree.
Yeah, in a dizzying fashion. You spoke a few minutes ago, Alex, about Aristotle following up on Socrates by bringing this world of the heavens and the world of man, so to speak, together. Did you want to say a few things about those hemispheres?
Yeah, well, so we'll start maybe with the study of nature, right? And of course, like I said, the early Greek philosophers were very interested in nature, and especially how do we explain this phenomenon of change, right? So at its most radical, Parmenides denies the very possibility of change because he says nothing can come into being or pass out of being. So probably the most important idea, if I only want to focus on one, would be Aristotle's idea of the four causes, because this is really emerges out of an effort to account for change, right? So on the one hand, we have the efficient cause, which is what we ordinarily think of as change, right? The agent that brings about change. When you hit the baseball with your bat, the motion of your bat is the cause of the baseball moving, right? And there's probably the ordinary sense of change, right? But he also makes use of the notions of form and matter. If I were to take that baseball bat and put it in the fireplace until it turned to ash, right? There's no baseball bat at the end of that process. So what happened? Well, Aristotle says what happened is that something receives a new form, right? And so he takes this Platonic idea of the forms, right, but brings them very much to earth. In fact, if you look at that painting behind me, Aristotle's hand is pointing toward the earth to represent this idea, right? So this idea of the form, right? So the ash is a form, the baseball bat is a form. So what was it that changed, right? What changed, he says, is the matter, the subject of change, right? So you have the same matter that is at one moment at point A, a baseball bat at the next moment is ash, right? And so this is an effort to account for the Parmenidean dilemma. You would think we could think of it in a way, right? Something changes, but something does not change, right? The matter doesn't change, but the form changes. So we have the formal and material cause, and then we have another idea which I think is extremely central to Aristotelianism, which is the final cause, right? So Aristotle believes that processes in nature have ends, right? If you think of the embryo, right, becoming the chicken, or the acorn becoming the oak tree, right? So he thinks that there's a telos, there is a purposeful activity going on within the acorn, driving it towards becoming the tree, or the embryo driving it towards becoming the chicken. And even though, I mean, what I think is very interesting is even though modern science doesn't like to talk about final causality anymore, since Bacon and Descartes and so forth. I think we still almost can't help it. When somebody's lung is not working, we say they're not breathing right, which implies that the lung is supposed to be doing something which it isn't, right? Or the heart is not circulating blood correctly. I mean, it's very hard to think of even something as basic as the human body without, well, that's not very basic actually, but something as complex as the human body without thinking without thinking of purposeful activity. And of course, his notion of rational inquiry into nature ultimately leads him to the conclusion out of natural philosophy into metaphysics, with his idea of there being a first mover or God, which becomes the lead into another topic in which Aristotle is very central, which is theology. He basically divides the speculative sciences into natural into the natural, the mathematical, and the theological. So hopefully that gives a little sense of his natural philosophy.
Well, it does, Alex, because on the one hand, I think you've given a sense of how logic and classification help him to, as it were, divide and structure the world into components that are intelligible, which serves our purpose of coming to know things. In terms of the idea of purposefulness, you understand how the world of ethics or politics is relevant to natural philosophy. His natural approach, I'm expecting, will inform the way he approaches ethics and politics. Is that an accurate guess?
Absolutely, yes. Right. So I mean, so when I talked about Aristotle bringing together natural philosophy and the science of man, that Socrates, and ethics, what Socrates was so interested in, the good life. This is precisely what Aristotle does, because what he wants to do now is how do we fit man within the natural schema, right? So he wants to say, so what is essentially the end of man, right? And you could say he brings in logic in a sense also, right? Because he says, well, man is an animal being anything that has sensation. But what is specific to man, what differentiates him from all other animals, which is reason, right? And so there's this idea, yes, all human beings do seek after a supreme good, which is happiness, eudaimonia, right? Happiness. But in what does happiness or the good life consist? He argues that it will consist in the performance of man's function, right? And how do you know the function of anything? It's the good that it alone can do, right? So we don't judge a good lungs by how well they circulate blood, right? We judge good lungs by how well they breathe. Similarly, we judge a good human life, says Aristotle, by how well a man lives according to his rational nature, right? And this is really going to be the life of virtue, right? And he divides the virtues or excellence into two kinds: intellectual excellence and moral excellence. And the key idea with regard to moral excellence is going to be this idea of the mean, right? So if we want to know, for example, what is a courageous person, what is courage? Well, on the one hand, we know that the person who is supposed to guard something and flees in terror at the oncoming troops is not exemplifying the virtue of courage. That would be cowardice, right? Giving in to one's fear. But at the same time, we would say that the person who likes to lie down on railroad tracks as the oncoming trains come, we wouldn't call that person courageous. We call them sort of foolishly rash, right? So it's the judgment of the mean, right? In which virtue or excellence is embodied, right? Which is a rational ordering of the passions. And you could think of this. You think of in relation to money, right? Generosity, right, is the mean between someone who's just constantly spending prodigally and the stingy person or the miser, right? And so much of the Nicomachean Ethics is spent trying to ascertain what the virtues mean in relation to each area of human life. And so ultimately, and for Aristotle and for many of the ancients, this is all a pre-Machiavelli sort of notion. The ethics lead him right into his politics. These are really kindred works. So maybe I should say a little bit about his politics as well.
I think it might be interesting. Yeah, it gives a real sense of his enduring relevance for people. We talked briefly about how he had a legacy in the sciences that you see in modern figures like Darwin, but in many ways that's also the case for the politics, is it not?
Absolutely, and even the modern thinkers who reject Aristotelianism, and you could think of Thomas Hobbes, for example, right? I mean, there are many modern thinkers who reject Aristotle, still think of him as the man to beat, right? In other words, you need to sort of overcome the Aristotelian worldview to establish their own. So we have this idea. I mean, I think Fred Miller had a very good characterization of Aristotle's politics, might make it intelligible in terms of the four causes, right? So on the one hand, we have the final cause, which we already know, right? It will be this life of virtue or reason. And Aristotle feels that the life of moral virtue cannot be lived in a simply solitary way. Because, for example, I mean, even on a basic level, how does one be generous if there's no one to be generous to? How do you be just if there's no one to be just to? The moral virtues are kind of social virtues. But he'll also famously argue that man is a political animal with these gifts of language and, with the sort of cooperative nature, which he calls it koinonia, fellowship, right? Sort of the friendship, which is essential to man's life in community. We need to sort of attain this end of the good life in this context, right? So this is really the final end. Now, if we think of the material cause, right? What is the material cause of the politics? It'll be the citizen, right? And so Aristotle will basically defines the citizen as, I mean, at least within the Greek context, is going to be the one who participates in the judicial and deliberative functions of the cities, right? I talked in the discussion with Ted a little bit about this idea that the idea would be that those who are bound by the law are those who make the law, right? So there's kind of this Greek idea of a kind of autonomy, which is, I think, at the root of his notion of citizenship. Then if we think of the formal cause, we can think of the formal cause is really the constitutions, right? The different constitutions that different forms of government will have. And I think one very important idea that Aristotle discusses is the idea that against Plato, right? Plato's Republic is all focused on the idea of educating an elite set of human beings to govern, and that this is the best way to organize things. Aristotle is very dubious about this and argues that government by laws is better than government by human beings because of human corruptibility. And he discusses in the regimes, right, the basic three ways you can organize things are you can have one ruler, a few rulers, or many rulers. Monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, which he sometimes calls politeia, polity. But each of these have their own corruptions, right? He doesn't unequivocally favor any one of them. He thinks each of them has their pluses and minuses, as it were, and each of them is vulnerable to corruption, right? So monarchy corrupts into tyranny, aristocracy into oligarchy, and democracy into a kind of rule by demagogues, like a lawless rule of majorities bound by no laws. And so what marks these for Aristotle are the rulers aiming at the common good of the society, or they're aiming at their own private good, right? The tyrant who makes a law, I think that house looks good, that'll be mine, is making a law for his own private benefit, and therefore is acting tyrannically. So that is in terms of the formal cause, and then the efficient cause really is the ruler, right? The statesman, right? So these are sort of the topics that he covers in the politics. So that was kind of whirlwind.
Absolutely. Viewers who are starting to understand Charles Murray's high esteem of Aristotle now have a huge reading list to send them scrambling to the libraries. So before they dash off, Alex, can you tell people watching some of the ways that they can join our various conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, we have a YouTube channel, so I invite you to take a look at the other videos, right? And we have a website, www.petrarch-institute.com. And again, I mean, the most we're very interested in getting students, so I invite anybody interested in our topics to email me, and I'll give you the email again, alex@petrarch-institute.com. So that's the basic information.
Yeah, and one of the other places you can find our students past and present is on our Twitter account, and that is at Petrarch Center, CENTRE on Twitter. And there and elsewhere, we look forward to seeing you. Alex will also be seeing them again for the next podcast.
Absolutely. And the last thing I should mention also is we have a LinkedIn group, the Petrarch Humanities Association. So if people have a LinkedIn account, feel free to send me a membership request, and that should be interesting. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Do you want to say anything else, Miles?
Just you mentioned the LinkedIn account. I'm not sure if everyone, or the LinkedIn group, not sure if everyone knew about that from past podcasts. And some of the most interesting extended discussions where some of these ideas get hashed out with a lot of interesting and different perspectives from people in different professions have happened there. So that is well worth a mention.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of the ideas that for podcasts that we might come up with may come out of those discussions, which will give you an opportunity to help shape us in a sense. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and speak to you next time. Take care.